President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. called for a whole-of-society approach and a partnership between the government and the local residents. This as the president vowed to exercise strong political will for the success of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. President Marcos Jr. renewed his commitment to normalize the Bangsamoro communities, especially members of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front or MILF and Moro National Liberation Front or MNLF. The president said peace is not achieved in one sitting alone, as he highlighted his attendance to the Intergovernmental Relationship Body last February. Meanwhile, torrential rains and flooding in Tanzania have caused over 800 deaths and more than 200 injuries, while affecting more than 200,000 others. Residents of a village in Kenya are trying to come to terms with their loss after a truck carrying a group of people overturned crossing a swollen river. People fell into the water as it tipped over and were carried away as onlookers rushed to the riverbank. The exact number of casualties remains unclear. For his part, Prime Minister Kassim Majaliwa urged people living in low-lying areas to move to higher ground and urged local governments to ensure relief and supplies to those who have lost their homes. Deadly flooding is not uncommon in the region. More than 300 people died late last year in heavy rains and floods in Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia. In other news, America's high-tech industry is looking at the presumptive U.S. presidential candidates and their priorities concerning semiconductors. The Biden administration last week announced a major investment for the industry. VOA's Carolyn Prosuti reports.
They're in our phones, our electric cars, our satellites, and even our refrigerators. Semiconductors, invented in the United States. But now only about 12% of chips are made in America.
American manufacturing is back.
Through his Chips and Science Act, President Joe Biden campaigned this week with $6 billion in federal grants for Micron's new plants in New York and Idaho. Added to Micron's own $125 billion, Biden says it's the biggest private investment ever in the two states.
Folks, my predecessor and his MAGA Republican friends have a very different view. They oppose the Chips and Science Act that's powering this growth today. We got to stop this division. I promise to be president for all of America, whether you voted for me or not. Today's investment helps Americans everywhere.
During his presidential term, Donald Trump had Intel's then CEO announce the company's $7 billion chip project from the Oval Office.
Thank you, Mr. President, for this.
But there was no government money backing the project. Subsidizing semiconductor companies is a fairly new policy, and experts say it's where the two presidential candidates differ.
You know, in 2015, if you'd asked most Americans, if you'd asked the Obama administration, do we need a chips policy? They would have said, no, everything's fine. What are you worried about? So this has only been recently, and the Trump administration changed our views towards China. This administration, though, has been the one that's been able to actually carry out some useful plans.
Trump, as president, handled China's threat in a different way. He used tariffs.
We've taxed China on $300 billion worth of goods and products being sold into our country, and China eats it.
$50 billion of that was on high-tech items. More recently on the campaign trail, candidate Trump on what he would do in a second term.
I will revoke China's most favored nation's trade status.
Since it was introduced, Biden's Chip and Science Act has triggered 83 projects to eventually increase the U.S. share of semiconductor manufacturing. Lewis says should Trump be reelected, he would need to implement a Chips and Science Act Part 2 to continue those efforts. Carolyn Prosuti, VOA News.
This is William Theo. Stay informed, get ahead, get the news right here.